Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Islamic Thoughts Podcast, episode 4. Today we have a very special episode for you guys today, which is a collaboration between the Islamic Thoughts server and the Sunni Defense. So, with my special guest, Abu Abbas, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, couldn't be better. So, today we're going to be discussing a very, very huge topic. And this is the topic essentially when it comes to hadith and the differences or the foundations really between the Sunni texts and the Shi'ite texts, where they come from, sort of the scope of where they stand today in terms of the polemics, in terms of the discussions, and also in terms of really identifying the Sunnah, the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how it affects us in our day-to-day life and the authenticity that we can actually relate it back to. Now, before we actually get into the episode, there's a few things that I'm just going to quickly cover. The first thing is that the Sunni defense. Now, one of the key things that they do in terms of the videos and in terms of the content that they post is actually address many of the issues that concern issues within not only the polemical issues but also the hadith issues and how the sources are actually maintained and many times the historical discourse that actually took place. So from that perspective, the Islamic Thought Server is really a discussion, really a platform where all of these discussions can actually be taking place at a very, very root level. And one of the reasons why we've had this collaboration is to really bring these two aspects together. First being, the academic aspect of it, and secondly, the discussional aspect of it. Why is this discussion even necessary today? One of the questions that we get asked very frequently on the server is, how can we trust Sunni Hadith? How can we trust Shi'ite Hadith? And is there an objective way for us to actually approach these two texts and see which one is more reliable in order for us to get closer to the Sunnah as Muslims? So, just to confirm, we are now on iTunes, we are on various other platforms, which will have all the links in the description box below. And furthermore, we'll also post a direct link to the server within itself. So if anyone has any questions or if anyone has any discussions that they would like to bring forward, they are more than welcome to and join into the discussions. So to get into it, the first question that I want to really begin with, Abu Abbas, is why is there even a need in the academic limelight to actually discuss the differences between the Sunni Hadith and the Shia Hadith?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أما بعد. The reality of the matter is that I think this is a great topic, really important topic that needs to be addressed. And I appreciate the Islamic Thought Podcast for hosting me over here today so we can get the opportunity to address this topic, inshallah. Now, to answer your question, Akhi, this matter really comes down to one main issue. Now, in Islam, we have different schools, we have different sects, we have disagreements, we have fundamental theological disagreements with various opposing schools and madhabs. And often, these disagreements actually trace back to our narrative on the seerah, to our historical narrative. And the reality of the matter is that the Sunni narrative on the seerah and the Prophet's life and later historical events is drastically opposed to the Shi'ite narrative on the seerah and later historical events after the Prophet's life. So an objective bystander would look at both traditions and recognize that both cannot be right. It's either one of them is right or both of them are wrong. So today, inshallah, we're going to maybe look into the both traditions and compare them and evaluate their historicity and see which one is a more reliable tradition when presenting the Prophet's seerah and his teachings and whatnot.
Yep, absolutely. So one of the key things that I would really like to identify here at this point is that we are essentially attempting to find, the objective truth in terms of the Sunnah. In one of the previous episodes, we discussed the sources from where we, as Muslims, gain our belief from and gain the usuli aspects, the principles, to actually derive fiqh and rulings from. So this is why it is very, very crucial for us to actually identify uh, where we can actually get the sunnah from and how we actually get the sunnah from in terms of the hadith. So the first things that really comes to mind is, many will say that why can't we just accept both? Why can't we accept both the Sunni sources that are available and the Shi'i sources that are available? I mean, what's the problem with reconciling and, sort of finding the middle way in terms of how we actually do Mustalah al-Hadith?
Okay, so this is a good question, a really important question actually, and it directly leads or relates to my previous point. So there are certain elements in both traditions that are irreconcilable. To give you an example, it is authentically reported in the Shia tradition that all the companions of the Prophet ﷺ apostatized after his death. Aside from a few, in some narrations there are 3, some narrations 4, some narrations 7. So these people believe that every single companion of the Prophet literally apostatized after his death. Now, obviously, we
Wow.
shouldn't have good reasons to reject this notion, but this is just an example of where we can look at the stark difference. So someone who is telling you that all your sources, all your Sahaba, they're kuffar, that means you cannot take a hadith from them. That means you've literally thrown everything they've transmitted in the trash. And there are various elements in the seerah that simply cannot be reconciled. This contradictions, plain contradictions. And maybe someone will be able to reconcile certain things. But as I said, there are a lot of major, fundamental, pivotal points in the seerah and in the narrative of the seerah where we drastically differ.
Wow, that's really crazy, because I mean, when we think that, that amount of companions so-called apostated, I mean, it causes a really big issue here, because if we aren't going to sort of identify and link the hadith and the sources that we have back to those that were with Rasulullah within his lifetime, where can we turn to? And one of the the appeals that the Shiite tradition makes is that we should follow Ahlul Bayt, and we should follow the link through that very chain in order for us to get to the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what's one of the main issues with actually this appeal that they make, that Ahlul Bayt is sufficient for us to use as a chain to get the hadith of Rasulullah?
All right, so this question embodies several premises we need to address. So there are several hidden premises behind this question that are simply false or contested. We cannot, we're not going to grant it to anyone. So first of all, the Sahaba are not kuffar. We have no reason to believe that. These people spread Islam and they upheld Islam after the death of the Prophet. They preserved the Quran. They, as I said, maintained, the religion across the Arabian Peninsula and eventually across vast parts of the Muslim, the later Muslim world. Now, with that being said, there's a premise behind your question, which is, well, why cannot we take religion from Ahlul Bayt? Now, there's several assumptions behind this claim. One is that Sunnis do not take their religions from Ahlul Bayt, which is false. And there's another assumption, which is that we must take religion from Ahlul Bayt. Now, we as Sunnis, we have a more nuanced take. Someone being from Ahlul Bayt does not by default make him a reliable transmitter. And just to clarify for the viewers, just in case they don't know, Ahlul Bayt is a term that is used to describe the Prophet's family, and it spans anyone who is from the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ, according to the Shia. And this is another issue, subhanAllah, where we disagree, which is what constitutes Ahlul Bayt. And this is a whole new debate. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, you Sunnis take from the Sahaba and we take from Ahlul Bayt, because it's false. We also transmit a hadith through Ali ibn Abi Talib. We also transmit a hadith through Ibn Abbas, the Prophet's cousin, Al-Hussein, Ali ibn al-Hussein. Al-Baqir, for example, Muhammad al-Baqir, alayhi salam, who is one of the 12 Imams among the Shia, he's a transmitter in our sources. In every single source we have. So the 6 books we have, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, they all transmit through him. Ali ibn al-Hussein, same thing. Ja'far al-Sadiq is a transmitter in our sources. So it's just fallacious, this appeal in so many ways. And the issue is much more nuanced than how these Shia polemicists make it seem. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Yeah, definitely. I guess one of the appeals that you hear very, very often is the hadith that where Rasulullah says that I leave you behind. And then in the hadith, he specifically identifies Ahlul Bayt. So, in summary, I mean, in the context of what we are discussing today, does this hadith actually have any implications to say that we can only take our hadith from Ahlul Bayt?
No, not at all. So when we bring a hadith, like this hadith, which is known as Hadith al-Thaqalain,
Yeah.
popularly known as Hadith al-Thaqalain, it's important that we, first of all, analyze the hadith, evaluate its different riwayat, its redactions, and cite the most authentic version of the hadith before we discuss its implications. And unfortunately, what ends up happening in Sunni Shia polemics is that people will go to the weakest version of that hadith and they'll cite it. And these are usually reports where the Prophet says, follow my Ahlul Bayt. You know, there's one report transmitted by Zayd bin Hasan al-Anmati, for example, in Jami' al-Tirmidhi. It's weak. You have a lot of similar reports. So I've done an analysis of this hadith myself, and it's published on ghadirkhum.com. So maybe, inshallah, we can put the link in the description somewhere, where
Yeah,
I
definitely.
analyzed the different riwayat of this hadith. And the conclusion was simply, there is no authentic text where the Prophet ﷺ explicitly says that we must follow Ahlul Bayt. Now, what the Prophet actually said that day is documented in Sahih Muslim and other sources. What the Prophet actually said is that he commanded us to hold on to the book of Allah. And then he reminded the Muslims of the rights of Ahlul Bayt upon them. So what was the Prophet referring to? Well, Ahlul Bayt have rights in Islam. The Prophet's family are entitled to certain rights that no one else has in our religion. So for example, Ahlul Bayt are entitled to 1/5 of the spoils of war. This is a right they have until the Day of Judgment. And so it's a burden upon the believers to uphold this right, and it's a responsibility. And so the Prophet ﷺ was reminding them of this responsibility. And the context of this hadith was that there was a previous dispute a Sahabi had with Ali regarding the spoils of war. There was Ali took, I think, a slave woman the other Sahabi wanted, and Ali took more ghanaim, more spoils of war than the rest of the Sahaba. And one of them was frustrated. He went to the Prophet, and the Prophet told him, "Do you hate Ali?" And the Sahabi told him yes. And the Prophet told him he has, his share in the spoils of war. So this is the context of the hadith. There was a dispute with Ali before that pertaining to the spoils of war and the ghanaim. And the Prophet is reminding the Muslims. And first of all, he commands them to hold on to the book of Allah. And then he commands them to uphold the rights of Ahlul Bayt upon them. Now, unfortunately, what ends up happening is you have a bunch of weak transmitters or Shi'ite transmitters that are weak, or liars, or unknown transmitters, who end up maybe erroneously or purposely transmitting this hadith as saying, I've commanded you to hold on to the book of Allah and family. That is not authentic. So again, this entire premise that we must take our religion solely from Ahlul Bayt is based on a variety of weak reports, weak and fabricated reports dispersed across Sunni and Shia tradition. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you actually made there in terms of actually identifying the actual authentic hadith or the narration that's authentic to begin with. Because this poses another question, which is the fact that as Muslims, we believe that the Quran and the Sunnah is the objective truths to which we actually conduct ourselves to, whether it's belief or actions. So then the question becomes, here, are we actually identifying the objective truth of the Sunnah, or are we really taking hadith and just using it for sort of theological arguments, let's say? So this becomes sort of the primary focus when we actually discuss the differences between the Sunni and the Shi'i traditions and the texts. And that leads me on to the actual topic of objective truth. Now, here we're actually attempting to establish the Sunnah and establish it through a methodology that will enable us to actually ensure that this is authentic. This is maybe not as authentic. This can be acceptable. Might be weak, and this may be fabricated. Now, all of these levels that an authenticity of a report may have is very, very crucial for the scholars of hadith and for those concerned with the tradition of Rasulullah to actually delve into and inspect very thoroughly. Because when that does no longer happen, then it sort of questions the authenticity of what we have in terms of beliefs and what we have in terms of practices. So then, one of the points that you mentioned before was that when it comes to Sunni sources and Sunni hadith texts, Sunnis accept Shi'ite transmitters. Now, I just wanted to really shed light upon one primary example that when it comes to transmitters within Bukhari and within Muslim, you mentioned that we do have Shi'ite transmitters, but for some reason, you don't seem to hear the same thing the other way around, where you have Shiite transmissions and you have Sunnis that are sort of established in the chain of narrations. Why do you think maybe this difference exists? And why do you think that maybe in the Sunni methodology, it's acceptable that even if this individual was Shi'i in his belief and in his theology, we still accept him as a transmitter of hadith?
All right, so this is a good question, but let me just clarify one thing, Aziz, before we answer the question. The reality of the matter is that even in the Shia tradition, you do have Sunni transmitters, and you do have some Sunni transmitters who were declared reliable. Just as in the Sunni tradition, you have Rawafid and Shia transmitters who were also declared reliable. So it's not as common in the Shia tradition, but it does exist, to be fair. Now, with that being said, what is our take in the Sunni tradition? Well, our take is that we accept the transmission of a transmitter so as long as he satisfies two main criteria. One is a concept known as adala. Essentially, we want to ensure that the transmitter is trustworthy. We don't want transmitters who have the audacity to tamper with reports, to purposefully tamper with reports and distort them. So this is the first main criterion we have, trustworthiness. At the same time, someone being trustworthy does not necessarily entail that he's reliable. He could have a bad memory. He can forget things. He could mix up reports, and he can have bad retention. So we also require another criterion, which is called dabt, retention. So we want to ensure that the transmitter has a good retention of the reports and that he can accurately reproduce them just as he had heard them, for the first time. So this is our take with transmitters. And the Shia, by the way, will claim the same thing. They have their own books on the Hadith sciences, albeit authored much, much later than Sunni sources. And some of their scholars, such as Al-Hurr al-Amili, by the way, actually argue that a lot of the technicalities of the Hadith sciences the Shias have were taken from Sunni scholarship. But that's a whole different debate.
Okay, I think this might be a good time to actually address another point. And that's the fact that why is it that when we actually look critically into the historical texts and the development of hadith and the literature concerning how it was codified, why is it that Sunni sources, generally speaking, tend to predate Shi'i sources? I mean, what is the reason for this? And I mean, to what extent can we actually say that, Sunni sources do predate Shi'i sources? Definitely, as many argue today.
Okay, Aziz, I suggest maybe we rephrase the question.
Okay.
Because there's some things, we don't know. A lot of things in history, the why is sometimes a bit vague for us. So what I suggest is, let's look. First of all, which sources come first? Now, in history, we know that the earlier a source is to the event it purportedly describes, the more reliable it is. And there's a rule historians use called the time and place rule. And it's common sense. The closer a primary source is in time to the historical event it describes, and the closer it is in location to the event it purportedly describes, the more reliable it is, right? So if we have a book that was authored, for example, 100 years after the death of the Prophet, and you have another book that was authored 400 years after the death of the Prophet, the book that is authored around 100 years generally will take precedence over the other source that is much later in history, right? And it's common sense. When you have, a much shorter gap in time between you and, the event you're describing, there is a much less risk or chance for error. There is a less chance that a liar is going to be in that chain, since you have less people in the isnad. There's less room for error as well, because you don't have as big of an isnad. And so, there's so many factors that come into play, but sources that are earlier in time and closer to the events they describe are generally more reliable. And this has nothing to do with Sunni Shia polemics, by the way. This is unanimously accepted among historians, the historical method. Even the muhaddithin agree to this. They have a concept called ulu and nuzul. When isnad is ali, the less men you have in a chain of transmission, the more reliable it is, because it's closer to the event you are addressing. Now, with that being said, the reality of the matter is that Sunni sources by far predate Shia sources in all aspects. So our sources, alhamdulillah, were authored much earlier than Shia sources. So, some of our earliest sources, for example, are Kitab al-Jami' by Ma'mar bin Rashid, who died in the year 153, around 140 years after the Prophet. Muhammad bin Ishaq died 151. Malik bin Anas, author of the Muwatta, died 179. Ismail bin Ja'far al-Ansari died 180. Abdullah bin Mubarak died 181. Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani 211. So we have a bunch of authors that died in the mid to late 2nd century, which is pretty early. And our later sources, such as Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani, died 211. Abdullah ibn Zubayr died 219. Sa'id bin Mansur 227. Ali ibn al-Ja'ad 230. Muhammad bin Sa'ad 230. And a bunch of other authors. These are our earliest sources. So we have mid to late 2nd century sources and early 3rd century sources. We have a bunch of later books as well, but these are our earliest sources. Now with the Shia sources, however, they all come much later than the Sunni sources. So the earliest Shia source, for example, was authored by Ahmad bin Muhammad al-Barqi, who died in 274. Now, this source comes more than 120 years after the Jami' of Ma'mar bin Rashid. And this book, by the way, is a small book. It's mostly pertaining to the virtues of the Imams. It has very little to do with the Prophet's seerah and the Prophet's biography. So it's a very little value when it comes to the seerah of the Prophet. We have, for example, the seerah of Ibn Ishaq in our sources, which is 151, very early. So we have a whole narrative on the seerah by the middle of the 2nd century. Unlike the Shia, where their first source comes in 274, which is pretty late. And that source is small, as we said. And just as a side note, An-Najashi, the Shi'i muhaddith, said that that book in his time, Kitab al-Mahasin, has been distorted. And he mentions this. And he mentions that there are additions in the book and there are subtractions. And so this source is just problematic for a bunch of reasons. But nevertheless, this is their earliest source that we have today.
Yeah. So
and they have other sources like Muhammad Hassan al-Saffar 290, and then it gets much worse. So we have al-Kulayni, author of al-Kafi 329. So these guys 200 years after the Sunni sources.
Wow. Okay.
So there's a huge gap in time when it comes to extant sources, and this is important that we emphasize. We're talking about extant sources. We're not talking about extant sources.
Is there any reason as to why, even though that those Sunni sources that we can see today that came before the initial Shi'i sources, is there a reason why Shi'is don't actually accept the earlier sources from the Sunnis, especially seen as though we've actually established the historical principle that being earlier to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam increases the reliability, right? So is there a reason why they don't accept it, or is it just an issue that according to their principles and methodology of hadith sciences, it doesn't fulfill the criteria? I mean, is there any such reason for this?
Well, the thing is that may vary depending on each person, but the general stance is that they do not accept the reliability of the authors of our books, which is very convenient for them because that just allows them to biasly dismiss everything we have. That's not how history works. Their scholars may have not known our muhaddithin, but we know them, and we've analyzed their reports, and we've concluded that they're reliable. So it's not a theological game where you choose to dismiss things you like and things you don't like. It's much more complicated than that, and this happens in both sides, by the way. So you have Sunnis dismissing Shia sources just because they're authored by Shias, and the reality of the matter is that we as Sunnis can reject these sources for objective reasons that have nothing to do with the religion of their authors. We have good reasons to say that these sources are problematic on paper, historically speaking. So unfortunately, they do not have the same thing when it comes to our sources. It's often accusations and slanderous claims made against the authors of books, and similar appeals.
Could you actually touch on, or maybe mention an example of an objective reason as to why we might actually not accept the source from when it comes to a Sunni to a Shi'i source?
Okay, so I'd actually like to mention several points over here. So the first point is very important. So first of all, you have early sources, which are the Sunni sources, presenting an entire narrative on the Prophet's life, right? That are much closer in time and place to the Prophet ﷺ. And what you have on the other side is these random sources that appeared hundreds of years later, presenting a drastically different narrative that is extremely theologically biased and charged. Now, with that being said, this is an indicator that there is a problem. It's a red flag. When later sources present a totally different narrative, this is usually a red flag and an indicator to question the reliability of these sources. Now, in and of itself, it's not necessarily an argument, but let's look at other important points. So, one point is that these sources are based on a false dichotomy, which Shias draw. Now, they'll tell you, well, you Sunnis rely on the Sahaba, while we Shias rely on Ahlul Bayt, and that's why we have our own sources. Well, this is simply false, first of all. We Sunnis rely on the Sahaba and Ahlul Bayt. We have transmission through Ali ibn Abi Talib. And actually, just as a side note, Ali ibn Abi Talib in Musnad Ahmad has more ahadith than Abu Bakr and Uthman combined. Okay? We're not like just taking stuff from a Sahaba and throwing Ahlul Bayt out the window. So that's just false from the start. But with that being said, this distinction between Sahaba and Ahlul Bayt is a false dichotomy. Because at the end of the day, as historians, what we want is primary eyewitnesses who witnessed events, reporting them to us. That is what we're looking for. Regardless of the transmitter's background, regardless of whether he's from the Prophet's family or not, whether he was the Prophet's friend or the Prophet's wife or the Prophet's cousin, that's not very relevant. If we can ascertain that the person is reliable and that the person is a primary eyewitness to the event he is reporting, then we accept it, regardless of who he is. That's why we have transmitters from Ahlul Bayt, we have transmitters from the Sahaba, we have transmitters from the Prophet's wife, from the Prophet's companions, from the Prophet's cousins, from the Prophet's neighbors. We have everything because we want primary eyewitness. This is what a historian wants. It's not a theological, marathon where we're just trying to prove our theology. We're trying to piece history together, and this is what we're doing. So this is one example why we do not, for example, rely on Shia sources. Now, this leads to my next problem. Since Shia sources, or since 12er Shiaism holds the position that most of the companions of the Prophet were apostates, they have a serious issue. They have a lack of eyewitness testimonies in their sources. So it's very rare to find reports that go up to the Prophet ﷺ through an eyewitness. They don't have Sahaba. And they'll tell you, Ali ibn Abi Talib was a Sahabi, and Hassan was a Sahabi, and Hussein was a Sahabi. Well, first of all, these three Imams, compared to the rest of the Imams, are rarely quoted in Shia sources, compared to Ja'far al-Sadiq, for example, or al-Baqir. With that being said, Ali was a little child in Mecca. He didn't witness everything. Al-Hassan and Hussein were less than 10 years old when the Prophet died in Medina. They didn't witness everything. Ali, Al-Hassan and Hussein experienced certain things with the Prophet, but they didn't see everything. You cannot put, or piece the puzzle with these three transmitters. There are a lot of events they did not witness. Now, if you're going to throw the Sahaba out of the window, you are going to have huge gaps in your narrative, in the seerah, that are just going to be there because you do not accept the majority of eyewitness testimonies. And this leads to another problem.
Is there even an actual objective reason as to why they sort of state that, majority of the Sahaba were actually apostates? Is there any actual objective reason?
This is a good question. So I'll address it, before I get to my next point. So it's all based on circular reasoning. So you know how we're addressing the reliability of historical sources right now? They have this circular reasoning argument. So they have ahadith in their sources, which state that the Prophet ﷺ explicitly named Ali as his caliph after him, right? Explicitly. So they believe that he said the Prophet's Ali's name. And they believe that anyone who rejects the explicit appointment of the Prophet is a kafir. That's pretty much it. And this is circular reasoning. So the circular reasoning is that they're assuming that their sources are reliable, and on that basis, they bring these ahadith to dismiss the reliability of our sources and argue for their sources. So it's circular reasoning. The premise is the same conclusion. We do not accept these reports. These reports are problematic for a variety of reasons, and there's nothing authentic in our sources that says this. And so this is the basis on which they make takfir of thousands of Sahaba. They say the Prophet appointed Ali, and they did not put Ali as the caliph after him, and therefore they're all kuffar, which is very pathetic, of a reason. And aside from the fact that it's historically not established. But yeah, nevertheless.
There seems to be sort of a very huge link here, because when we mentioned before that, the hadith where, follow my Ahlul Bayt, and the narration actually not being authentic in terms of the wording that they used to establish this basis, it seems as though the same principle applies here. And essentially, the parameters that they are setting here of who to take hadith from and who not to take hadith from are actually within themselves, not even based on Sahih Hadith, which seems to be quite surprising, actually.
Well, the thing is, I think the difference is that in our tradition, the Sunni tradition, Hadith is a historical tool. It's not a theological tool.
Yeah.
There's a stark difference. As I said, we are trying to come to the most accurate and reliable narrative in history based on the tools we have. Okay? It's not a theological appeal. We're not, constructing cults that revolve around certain individuals, certain families, certain dynasties. That's not our interest. We're interested in drawing a narrative that is reliable, historically accurate, regardless of, the person transmitting it, as long as he's reliable. Unfortunately, it seems like hadith in Shia sources is a bit more theologically charged.
Yeah.
There are a lot of theological notions that influence the way they address hadith and the types of narratives they'll accept and whatnot. Some of their scholars even mentioned that the requirement or criteria for an authentic Shia hadith and Shia sources is that the transmitters must be imamis, they must be Shias as well, which is preposterous. But nevertheless, Aziz, if you could let me get to my next point.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, go ahead.
So you asked me why we, some reasons why we reject Shia sources, and I mentioned that they do not have eyewitness testimonies earlier, right? And how they reject the Sahaba, and as a result, they just lack eyewitness testimonies. And you'll find this in their sources. Most of their reports do not go back to companions of the Prophet or to Ali or Hassan al-Hussein. They go back to Ja'far al-Sadiq, who died in the mid-2nd century. This person is not an eyewitness. Most of their reports also go back to Muhammad al-Baqir, who was not an eyewitness to the events of the Seerah. And they're called Ja'faris, by the way. So this is one of the other names used to refer to the Twelver sect, because most of their religion is based on traditions from Ja'far al-Sadiq, who was not a Sahabi. He died in around, the mid-2nd century. So this is the issue. Now, what is the problem over here? Well, the problem is that the Shia narrative cannot present a thorough narrative on the Prophet's life. Seerah. Because they have so many gaps, they really don't have much on the Seerah of the Prophet. So if you were to ask a Shia to rely on Shia sources to paint the Seerah, from day one till the end, with reliable sources according to the Shia, they won't be able to do that. They do not have classical Seerah works. Sunnis, on the other hand, for example, we have Ibn Ishaq, 151. We have a bunch of other sources on the Seerah. We have later Seerah. We have Musa ibn Uqba's Seerah transmitted in our sources. So we have a lot of different early sources that have collected the seerah of the Prophet, and we sort of have a monopoly on the seerah. So if you were to look at contemporary Shi'i works on the seerah, you'd realize that a lot of them are quoting Sunni sources. They have to rely on Sunni sources, and what they end up doing is they will quote the Sunni sources to essentially draw the skeleton of the seerah, their narrative, and then they'll appropriate it according to their own theology. So they'll add sprinkles here and there from their reports, but its basis is from our sources because they don't have classical seerah works, which is a huge problem. Now there are other issues we can get to later. I know we're going to address. So yeah, inshallah.
Which also adds on to the point that, the premise that they lay out, or rather the foundation that they lay out, to actually say that, you can't take from majority of the companions, doesn't actually work in practically speaking. Just with the example that you mentioned, that even when it comes to aspects of seerah, they're quoting, the Sunni texts anyway. So, I mean, it just shows how impractical it is from that objective level of actually reviewing history. So, one of the things that you mentioned before was that there are differences or, distortions within the texts, especially those texts that came after. So, to what extent is there, issues with the content, issues with, distortions of text where actual wordings may have been changed? I mean, is there specific examples of this? And, how far do these examples actually go in terms of being, problematic for us to actually take and use?
Well, to be frank, though, as I said earlier, since they don't transmit from the Sahaba, our sources of information are different. So their reports go back to Ja'far al-Sadiq mostly, and then his father, Muhammad al-Baqir. These are the two main transmitters in Shia sources compared to the rest of the Imams. Well, in our source tradition, we mostly transmit from the Prophet through the companions, which spans the debate as well. So if you look at Bukhari, for example, you will find that it has around 7,000 and something authentic prophetic traditions. Okay? Now, that's not the case in their sources. Their sources mostly do not consist of prophetic traditions. Now, my friend Hani actually performed an analysis. Hani is on the channel. Really nice guy. He's Lebanese too, by the way. An analysis of Kitab al-Kafi, and he literally went through every single report in al-Kafi. And he concluded that the prophetic traditions in al-Kafi, which is one of the major Shia collections, they're a minority. And he actually has statistics. Let me open them up over here in front of me. So we may, put a link, inshallah, because it's published on 12shia.net. Okay. So out of 16,109 traditions in Kitab al-Kafi, only 2,408 are prophetic traditions. So that's only around 14.86%. So you have their main book, only 14% of their main book consists of ahadith. Now, if we were to exclude weak reports, then obviously the percentages change. The percent of authentic reports in Kitab prophetic traditions in al-Kafi would essentially be around 5%. So only 5% of this book is authentic prophetic traditions. The rest of the prophetic traditions are all weak, according to Shia standards, by the way. And the rest are opinions of the Imams and sayings of the Imams. So, this really manifests in their sources. They're quoting two different sources of info. We have the Prophet ﷺ, who was our main, source of information through his companions and his transmitters. And for them, they're quoting the Imams. They're not quoting the Prophet. So to ask whether they have distortions or not, well, these are two fundamentally independent, pools of reports. They're different. They're not the same thing. They're not transmitting the same thing. They're not saying the same. I wouldn't know if we could say that, wallah, they distort Sunni Hadith because they're simply quoting different people, different sources.
Yeah. So, from what you just mentioned, so I mean, we can actually conclude that even though that we categorize them specifically as hadith, or maybe Shias categorize these narrations as hadith, many of them are actually not even coming directly from Rasulullah. They're actually coming from the Imams. Is this sort of the point that you're making too?
Yeah, that's an objective fact.
Yeah.
More than 85% of Kafi are the opinions of the Imams and the sayings of the Imams. So yeah, they do not simply, the Prophet is rarely quoted in their sources. Now, they try to have, their cake and eat it, and they say, Wallahi, the Imams are infallible. Obviously, that's circular reasoning again, because
Yeah.
you can only conclude that through the Shi'ite sources. So they argue that the Imams are infallible, and therefore, they also believe that the Imams receive revelation from, which is also circular reasoning, because the same conclusion can only be reached through Shi'ite sources. So they're already assuming that the sources are reliable to argue for the reliability of their sources. Nevertheless, they believe that the Imams are infallible and they receive revelation from Allah. So even though their Imams never met the Prophet, most of them, they will believe that a quote from Ja'far al-Sadiq to the Prophet without any transmitters between them is still authentic, which is preposterous. You have more than 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, 300 years between the Prophet, not 300, maybe 250 years, between the Prophet and some of these. Yet they will accept the transmission of individuals directly to the Prophet, regardless. So there are a lot of issues that come up when we actually look at.
So one of the main topics that actually involves this discussion is the science of hadith, both in theory and in application. And one of the points that we've actually covered already is that they actually use only those that are from Ahlul Bayt to actually establish the hadith. So then this prompts a question. With the Sunni muhaddithin, the early ones, they actually identified an objective method to reach the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the use of identifying specific transmitters and whether accepting or rejecting those transmitters. So here's the thing. What is really essentially the differences that come when Sunni scholars of hadith analyze transmitters within the chain, and when Shi'i muhaddithin analyze the same transmitters in this chain? I mean, can we say that both are using an objective method to identify the authenticity of the chain with those transmitters within the chain, or is there a discrepancy, especially when we look at it from a Shia angle?
Well, okay, this is a good question. And I think we should take a step back and just talk about how authentication works in our sources and in their sources. So in our sources, obviously, when we evaluate transmitters, we look at the sayings of the various muhaddithin, the hadith critics, who evaluated the reliability of these transmitters, tested them, examined their ahadith, and then concluded whether they made mistakes, whether they added things or distorted reports or tampered with reports or forgot things in the hadith, and they essentially graded their reliability. So they tell you this person is weak, this transmitter is reliable. So this is how we verify the reliability of transmitters for the most part. And we have a lot of to believe that it was an objective process. My friend Abdullah Mu'taz has a small booklet or a book, ebook published, which is called In Defense of the Hadith Method, where he goes over several methods that are used by the muhaddithin. And maybe I can go over them, inshallah. So one of the methods the muhaddithin used to use, the Sunni muhaddithin obviously, to evaluate the reliability of a transmitter is to cross-examine all of his reports. So you have a transmitter who transmits, for example, 10 reports. Okay? How do we know that this person is actually a reliable person, a trustworthy person, and someone who is not tampering with reports or making mistakes in these? Well, what they used to do is they cross-examine all of his reports and they compare it to what all the other transmitters from the same teacher transmitted. So let's say he's a teacher with 20 other people. Okay, so are his reports similar to their reports? Is he corroborated, or does everything he transmit end up being exclusive? Okay, so if it's exclusive, obviously there's a red flag. When you have someone transmitting a hadith from a teacher, which none of the other students have, this is a red flag, right? So this is one way the hadithin used to identify liars and weak transmitters, through exclusive transmission. We want transmitters to be corroborated, and we want the hadith to be supported by independent transmission of the same hadith. And that's how we often come to the conclusion that it's reliable. Now, another way we identify the reliability of the transmitters, or how we discern it is that these transmitters, if they are corroborated, so someone transmits hadith X, well, we find another transmitter or 5 other transmitters that transmit hadith X. Okay, so how similar are their texts? Did the transmitter we are evaluating forget a sentence? Did he add something? Did he mix up 2 ahadith together? Is there any different detail in his ahadith that goes against the reports of the other transmitters from the same teacher? So this is another indicator we use to evaluate the reliability of a transmitter, which is conflicting transmission. So when a transmitter has regular conflicting transmission, this is another red flag that he's reliable. It could indicate that he has a bad memory, that has bad retention. Maybe he doesn't write his ahadith and he forgets them, and he ends up making mistakes. So there are 2 indicators that muhaddithin use: tafarrud, exclusive transmission, regular exclusive transmission, and regular conflicting transmission, al-mukhalafa. Now, when these 2 factors are found in transmitters and they become common, they become weak, and they grade them weak on that basis. And there are other ways. They used to test transmitters. They used to go to them to repeat, transmitting a hadith after, long gaps in time, and then they'd compare their different transmission. There's a lot of ways, and they're very objective. It has nothing to do with the transmitter's background, and hence why you find reliable Shi'ite transmitters in our, find reliable Mu'tazili transmitters in our sources. You find reliable Zaydi transmitters. You find reliable Khariji transmitters, and you find reliable Nasiri transmitters as well. And you find reliable Sunni transmitters. Likewise, you find weak transmitters from all of these, including Sunni. So it's not a theological tool we use to evaluate transmitters. No, it's purely historical. Now, when it comes to the Shia sources on Rijal, however, we have a problem. We don't really know the methodology of the Shia Muhaddith. We don't know how they concluded someone was reliable or not. What are the indicators they used? It's very vague. Nothing is mentioned. All we have are primarily several works the Shia rely upon to evaluate transmitting. And so some of them are, for example, Rijal al-Tusi, who died in the year 460. This guy's a much later source. That's a red flag in and of itself. Nevertheless, they have Rijal al-Najashi, died 450. You have Rijal al-Kashi, who died before them. You have al-Mufid, the Sheikh al-Mufid, the 5th century scholar, also, talking about some transmitter. You have Ali bin Ibrahim al-Qummi, supposedly endorsing transmitters in his tafsir. That's a whole different debate. And there's a whole argument within Shia circles whether his book is reliable in the first place, whether it's complete, whether it's actually his book. That's a whole different issue. But nevertheless, so these are the 2 main sources there: Rijal al-Tusi and Rijal al-Najashi. And all you have in reality is these 2 men who came much later in time. We're talking 5th century over here, and they're just saying so and so is reliable, so and so is weak. And for most transmitters in their books, they don't even mention a verdict. It's very rare that they'll grade a transmitter and talk about it. So they're just endorsing and condemning transmitters. We don't know how they came to those conclusions. We don't know why they came to those conclusions. They have not outlined their methodology when analyzing transmitters. Well, in the Sunni tradition, on the other hand, we have books like the books of Su'alat, the books of Ilal, books like Al-Kamil by Ibn Adi, rahimahullah, where we actually, have the methodology outlined. We know why they said so-and-so is weak. We know the hadith where he made mistakes in. We can pinpoint every single, reason why he was weak. And this can be done for most transmitters in our source. They cannot do that. So, there's a lot of issues, and this is one problem. And this manifests in a huge phenomenon I observed in their sources as a direct result of this problem. And maybe I can address that before we move on to the next topic.
Sorry, just before you address it, I just have a very quick question. So, when you speak about Ilm al-Rijal and the books that the Sunnis actually have today, I mean, can we actually look at various chains and objectively use these books of Ilm al-Rijal to actually identify, using the same methodology that they had in the earlier times, to dedicate whether a transmitter was reliable or not?
Definitely. We can come to independent conclusions regarding the reliability using the same method, and it's in line with what they concluded. So, for example, my friend Abdullah Mu'taz has a video on Maybe we can add that in the description, the link, where he actually does his own analysis, independent analysis of a transmitter who was
Yep.
declared reliable. I forgot his name. And he concluded that he was reliable. He was corroborated. He did not make mistakes in the hadith he transmitted when we compare his reports to other transmitters. And he was able to come to the same conclusion the muhaddithin came to. Okay? Now, again, in Shi'ite sources, however, you don't have books of ilal. You don't have books of su'alat where the methodologies are outlined. So you just have Tusi and Najashi saying, so-and-so is reliable, so-and-so is weak. We don't know why. And a Shi'i cannot really come to the same independent conclusion. Why? Because most of the transmission in these sources is exclusive. You don't have a lot of corroborations in Shi'i sources when it comes to the transmitters of the upper layers that transmit from the Imams. And later transmitters as well. So like Ibrahim bin Hashim al-Qummi, for example. So this is a huge problem. And it has nothing to do with theology, by the way. This is pure history. I'm not talking as a Sunni. I'm talking here as a historian who's evaluating both traditions, hopefully, inshallah, in an impartial manner. So yeah.
So those that actually say or make the claim that, Sunni muhaddithin had a bias towards the way that they describe these transmitters in their books of al-Rijal, essentially, it's nonsensical, because as we've just compared and as we've established, when we compare the books of al-Rijal and when we actually see how, the transmitters were analyzed specifically, each one by one, we can actually identify that there is one objective method that thoroughly inspects each transmitter, as opposed to just a verdict. And a lot of the times, within the Shia methodology, that verdict may not even be conclusive, right? But we don't have that much information for us to even come to a conclusion as we can do using the Sunni methodology.
Definitely. Now, to give you an example, ya akhi, regarding the objectivity of our muhaddithin, in books like Al-Ilal by Ibn Abi Hatim or Al-Mawdu'at by Ibn al-Jawzi, and other sources, you find the muhaddithin weakening ahadith that support their theology. So we have ahadith in the virtues of Abu Bakr, for example, and the virtues of Umar, and the virtues of Uthman, which we acknowledge are fabricated. These people were not trying to just biasedly authenticate everything that supported their theology. That's not how it worked. We criticize reports that support our theology. Why? Because it's objective. It's not authentic to the Prophet. We have no reason to believe it's authentic. So even though it is in line with our biases, we don't accept it. And this goes the other way around. So we have reports in our sources that could be easily misunderstood and be perceived as conflicting with our theology, yet they transmit it, and they don't have a problem. And it's pretty evident. And I'd refer the reader to Kitab al-Mawdu'at by Ibn al-Jawzi if they're interested, to see what the muhaddithin had to say about a lot of the reports, for example, and the virtues of Abu Bakr, and the virtues of Uthman, and the virtues of Umar, and the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib. So you have ahadith that are criticized by the muhaddithin in the virtues of all these figures. Now, if they were biased, if they were theologically charged or motivated, when grading a hadith, they'd have no reason to criticize these reports. So yeah, with that being said, Aziz, there was an important point I wanted to get to regarding Shia Rijal. So as we said earlier, we don't really know whether At-Tusi and Al-Najashi actually had objective methodologies. Tusi and Najashi are the two main Shia hadith critics the Shia rely on to evaluate transmitters. We don't know if they had an objective methodology. We don't even know if they had a methodology in the first place. Now, the Shia, muhaddith, Sayyid Hussein Qazwini, who's on Twitter, by the way, actually, gifted me his book, and I really appreciate it. He has a book called Durus fi Ilm al-Rijal, which is recently published. And in it, however, I found something very problematic. He talks about At-Tusi and Al-Najashi, and I'm going to quote him, and he says this on page 32 of Durus fi Ilm al-Rijal. I'm going to just quote the English translation. He says, they, At-Tusi and Al-Najashi, would most often transmit the reports of a transmitter and then evaluate them based on their contents. If their contents were aligned with their theological positions, they would not weaken the transmitter. Otherwise, they would accuse him of weakness, deceit, and extremism. So this is a huge problem. So this is a Shia scholar, Muhaddith himself, acknowledging that At-Tusi and Al-Najashi often simply graded transmitters on the basis that, well, their reports agree with our theology, therefore we're not going to criticize them. And then if a transmitter transmitted a hadith that went against their theology, then they would criticize them. Now, this is a huge problem. This opens the door to bias. This opens the door to unreliability. I mean, the fact that a transmitter transmits a hadith that is not in line with their theology has no implications on his reliability. So there's so many issues in their methodology, and it manifests in one huge problem. So this is what I was going to get to earlier, which are, the problematic transmitters that are endorsed in Shia sources. So as you may know, we do have some transmitters that are found in the Sunni and the Shiite tradition. So they transmit the hadith in both traditions. So they're common links, if you could call them that. And you will find that the Shi'i muhaddithin endorse transmitters who are known liars and extremely weak transmitters in Sunni sources. So you have these guys endorsing a bunch of liars, a bunch of fabricators, a bunch of weak transmitters, a bunch of unknown transmitters in their sources. And I've actually compiled the list of transmitters who satisfy this criterion. So you have so many transmitters. They were declared to be liars in these sources. Let me give you an example. Aslam bin Hawshab. Aslam bin Hawshab was a transmitter from the late 2nd century. And this guy was declared to be a liar in our sources. And by the way, this guy transmits a hadith in the virtue of Abu Bakr and Umar, our sources, in Mu'jam al-Tabarani. So there wasn't, if they were biased, they would have actually endorsed him to accept his hadith and the virtues of Abu Bakr and Umar. And I cited him, by the way, and his hadith article, 10 reasons why you should not trust the Shia hadith tradition. So this guy was declared to be a liar in our sources, okay? And some of our muhaddithin even met him. So Al-Jawzajani said, for example, I transcribed hadith from him in the city of Hamadan in the year 202, and he was weak. Okay, Ibn Hibban then later said he used to fabricate hadiths and ascribe them to reliable transmitters. And a bunch of other muhaddithin said the same thing. Now what you have is suddenly Al-Najashi, who came like 200 years later in the year 450, suddenly declares him reliable. And he says he was a reliable Ammi who transmitted a transcript from Abu Abdullah. Now Ammi in the Shia sources means Sunni. So this is the irony. So even they acknowledge he was a Sunni. So when the muhaddithin criticized him, it has nothing to do with his sect. He's declared to be a Sunni in Shia sources. Nevertheless, you have this liar who was endorsed in later Shia collections and accepted. And this is a huge red flag. It just shows you how problematic the reality is. And you have other transmitters, Ismail bin Abi Sukuni, Al-Harith bin Imran al-Ja'fari, Asbagh bin Nubata, and many others, Al-Harith al-A'wa, the fourth theory in our sources, they accept him. And there's so many other transmitters. SubhanAllah, and I have a list of 80 transmitters. I haven't published it. But in the future. And so you see this problem manifest in reality. You have liars and weak transmitters that are not necessarily even Shia, declared reliable in Shia sources. Wow. How are you guys endorsing these transmitters? How do you accept transmitting hadith through transmitters like this? Usually, their go-to appeal is, well, the Sunni muhaddithin were biased and they criticized them because they were Shia. Well, first of all, it's not true. Second of all, a lot of these transmitters were not Shia. Okay, so you cannot make this appeal. These guys are simply relying on liars and weak transmitters often to transmit their religion. So this is a huge problem, and I've elaborated on it. And if anyone's interested, inshallah, we'll mention the at the bottom, maybe in the description.
Yeah. I know that Abdullah Martiz, he touched upon the point of there being a huge lack of transparency within the Shi'i methodology. Today, in this current era, I know you mentioned an example before of a hadith scholar, the Shi'i, but today, is there, a normal layman, average Shi'i may ask and pose a question that, okay, you've presented to us the arguments that there is an objective format in which the Sunni muhaddithin have attempted to preserve the Sunnah, and here is a so-called objective method which seems to be self-contradictory when we actually analyze it. So when it comes to the question that they might ask, that where do we actually go from here? Because when it comes to using these methodologies and using essentially a objective methodology, I mean, how transparent is the Shi'i methodology to begin with, to give us an idea that, this simply won't work within this present era, in order for us to, actually establish the Sunnah the way that the Sunni Muhaddithin did so. I mean, I just want to ask maybe like an overview for a normal average layman Shi'i. I mean, how transparent is it? And because of the fact that we can't actually establish something objectively, what are the implications of this?
You see, Akhi, some people may not know how bad the situation is. So when you ask someone, how transparent is the methodology? This is assuming that a methodology exists.
Yeah.
Right? Now, as I said earlier, there are a lot of red flags make the objective bystander question the existence of methodology. When you have much later muhaddithin, the Shia muhaddithin, suddenly endorsing transmitters without mentioning their reasoning, the ways they came to those conclusions. We don't know their methodologies. We don't even know a lot about their lives, by the way, some of them. And they did not meet most of these transmitters since they're very late sources. And they often endorsed liars and non-weak transmitters that are Sunnis. This is like a red flag. This makes you question whether a methodology existed in the first place. So to answer your question, well, there may not even be a methodology in the first place. And now today, so the way Shia Hadith sciences work is that they take these endorsements from At-Tusi and Al-Najashi and they grade a hadith. So now there is a methodology they have later that is based on this baseless methodology. So now they rely on their endorsements. They go through a hadith in their sources and they say, well, this hadith is sahih, this hadith is weak. But in the reality of the matter, as we showed today, that may not have any value in reality, and it would be totally arbitrary, their entire system of authentication, simply because the foundations on which it is based, books like Rijal al-Tusi, Rijal al-Najashi, Tafsir ibn Abi Ibrahim al-Qummi, which is contested. There is a whole debate on whether Tafsir of Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi actually is his tafsir or just a compilation of a bunch of different tafasir, including his original tafsir. And they use this book as a means to authenticate a bunch of transmitters. So there are so many issues. And for the objective bystander, I just invite them critical and to actually do some research. And if something doesn't sound reasonable, why not look into the Sunni tradition? I think it's not an alternative. It is the default. And this is, I think, a mistake a lot of people. Our sources are earlier. Our sources are more prolific. Our sources are more transparent. Our methodology is known and it's outlined, and you can essentially reproduce every single conclusion that exists in our sources. It's just the default. We are not an alternative, and our traditions are not equals. We are at a much, higher advantage. And it's fallacious to say, wallahi, well, you have the Shia narrative. I know we said that in the beginning, but it's just for convenience, because most people will not understand the point until we address it. But they're not on the same level. We are like light years ahead. And I'm trying to not be biased when I say this. Everything I say actually comes after my analysis of the different sources. I was initially confused, by the way. I actually thought, maybe we can appeal to both methodologies and actually use both sources, both traditions. And I actually said this to Farid once. So if you guys don't believe me, contact Farid and ask him. We had discussions on this. If we could incorporate both traditions. I evaluated them. I did the research. And I concluded that they're not reliable. And there's so many issues. And I compiled some of them in my article. But wallahi, I actually tried to give them a chance. And I'm not saying this as someone who is just a polemicist who's trying to rip the tradition apart. I actually thought for a moment that maybe At-Tusi and Najashi can actually be very reliable sources of data, but that's not the conclusion I reached. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
In the first episode, when we actually discussed an introduction into hadith methodology, these were some of the points that we mentioned in terms of mustalah al-hadith and finding an objective method to reaching the sunnah, which is both reliable and authentic. So, these points that we've mentioned effectively translate into one key point, which is how do we establish the authority of the Sunnah? And once we do establish the authority of the Sunnah, it obviously has to be done through various sources that have been checked, according to the objective methodology, and thereafter concluded to the extent where we can actually use these. So then this question becomes that today, considering both methodologies that we've analyzed thoroughly, today exists compilations of hadith, both in Sunni tradition and the Shi'ite tradition. For example, within the Sunni tradition, we have the Kutub al-Sitta, the 6 books. And then in the Shi'ite tradition, you have other books that maybe don't even refer back directly to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here's my question. When it comes to the Shi'ite compilations of hadith today, I mean, what do we have that's available to us today that we can use in the same way that the Sunnis may use the 6 books of hadith to actually establish the Sunnah and understand it in a coherent way?
These are called the Kutub al-Arba'a. So we have the Kutub al-Sitta, the 6 books, which, by the way, are not as fundamental as some people think. We have tens of other hadith books that predate these sources. So these are not our only books. The Shia narrative is based on 4 main books. Read it from history. We would not lose a single hadith for the most part, because everything else is corroborated in independent sources. But nevertheless, so we have the Kutub al-Sitta, which are usually called, a canon today. The Shia have an analogous set of books, which is known as al-Kutub al-Arba'a. And these books are Kitab al-Kafi by al-Kulayni, Kitab Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih by Ibn Baboya, Kitab al-Istibsar by al-Tusi, and Kitab Tahdhib al-Ahkam by al-Tusi as well. So these are the main sources which their religion is primarily based on. They have other sources. They have, the tafsir of Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi. They have a bunch of other books by Ibn Baboya. And they have other collections that came later as well. So this is what their entire narrative is based on. As we said, it's mostly reports that go back to the Imams, and not prophetic traditions. So that's, I hope that.
So to essentially conclude, after reviewing the methodology behind how to actually even take and perceive these books, it's actually impossible to establish them as the Sunnah to begin with. I think one can conclude, if they look at it from an objective lens, that is. And just to move on to another point, which is the fact that when it comes to the reliability of the Sunnah, this becomes a key component within usul, as in usul al-fiqh, the principles of jurisprudence, how we actually form fiqh and, establish the worship on a day-to-day basis. So then the question becomes that because there's so many issues within the methodology of hadith, to actually analyze the Sunnah from a Shi'i perspective, what does one do when they approach the usuli aspects of this?
Wallahi, okay. So to address something, just before we move on. So regarding the Sunnah, so what they argue is that, well, we transmit from the Imams who are from Ahlul Bayt, and the Prophet's family are, more knowledgeable of the Sunnah. So this is what they argue. They conflate that with the Sunnah. Now, obviously, this is problematic for several reasons. The Imams, such as Ja'far al-Sadiq, Muhammad al-Baqir, they transmitted from transmitters that were not from Ahlul Bayt. So their sources are not always from Ahlul Bayt, and we see this in our books. We transmit from them. Al-Baqir transmits from a bunch of tabi'een that are not from Ahlul Bayt. So nevertheless, the response obviously is, well, first of all, we don't negate the reliability of Ahlul Bayt. We have them in our sources as transmitters. At the same time, we also transmit from transmitters who know much more about the Prophet. People like the Prophet's wife, Aisha. This person literally lived with the man, for a long time, for years, years upon years. His other wives, Hafsa, who they hate, the Prophet's companions, people that went with the Prophet, in battle. These people spent quality time with the Prophet. Okay, so it's not fair for you, first of all, to claim that you have a monopoly on Ahlul Bayt, because that's simply not true. Second of all, it's not fair for you to claim that other individuals, may not have as intimate of a relationship with the Prophet as, someone who is a descendant of the Prophet that came 100 years later. It's just false. And so the entire appeal is theological and it's not historical. But nevertheless, just so that their position is made clear, they do sort of argue that Ahlul Bayt are carriers of the Sunnah, therefore, it actually is the Sunnah. So they say something that Ja'far al-Sadiq said, who died in 150 something later in history, is analogous to something the Prophet said. Something that Hassan al-Askari said is just as authoritative, legislatively speaking, as something the Prophet said. So this is what they do to bypass the issue in their sources. So yeah, so that was just to clarify. What was your actual question? Because I forgot it.
No, it's fine. So when it comes to usul and actually using the sunnah within usul, I mean, where did the Shia stand in terms of this? Do they have principles, or do they? Yeah.
Oh yeah, they do have usul. Now, fiqh is not my thing. I'm
Yeah.
not really interested in fiqh. I find it really boring. But nevertheless, so there's a lot of influence from the Mu'tazila on the Shia at one point in history. And you see this in certain individuals, people like Shaykh al-Mufid, people like Ibn Baboya al-Qummi. He essentially appropriated Shia theology, Mu'tazili theology into Shia. And so you'll find Kitab Tasih I'tiqadat al-Imamiyya. It's essentially a book on Mu'tazili theology for the most part.
Yeah.
So they do have usul, taken from a bunch of different sources, and it's actually not it's usul. So you have Al-Tusi has a book on usul, Al-Mufid has a book on usul. So they do have usul. Now, obviously, their sources are different. They're using reports from their imams. They're not using prophetic traditions. They're not deriving fiqh from prophetic traditions for the most part. So that's probably one of the major differences. But they do have usul.
Okay, so
Sciences.
This sort of brings us to this very, very big question. And this question is that, for most of the Shia laymen and those that, just generally want to practice and get on with it without getting into the discussions and the polemics and so on and so forth. I mean, what would be a recommended start? Something to actually go with as someone who's a Shia to actually analyze this objective method that we've spoken about in the Sunni tradition and take the first step to actually see how this works in a practical life of actually taking the Sunnah from an authentic source.
Okay. What I would recommend, regardless of whether he's Sunni or Shia, don't stay out of polemics. Okay, polemics taint everything. It's a charged, theologically motivated environment. People, make the most extreme appeals just to defend their religion. We need to get out of that mindset. We're trying to come to the truth. We're not trying to debate over here. We're not trying to, prove why you're wrong and why we're no. I would invite you to go through these sources, as much as you can without any luggage, from polemic. Go through the methodology of the muhaddithin. Actually read, what our muhaddithin have done. Maybe we can link, written by myself and my great friend Abdullah Mu'taz, that shed some light on the objectivity behind the muhaddithin. And it's a shame that this tradition is just thrown out the window often, and how they have concluded the other translators. And they have a bunch of articles, polemical cheap shots. So what I'd invite the reader is, get out of your polemical mindset, whether you're Sunni or Shia, and actually observe the texts for what they are. And usually, the advice a lot of people give is just read the Quran. Again, away from polemics. It's a book of guidance, and a lot of ex-Shias I know usually, say just read the Quran in itself is the truth, and it will lead you to the truth. If you lead it, obviously without any what's the word? Without anything, covering your eyes, right? That is distorting your understanding of the text. Just read the Quran, have a relationship with it, and get out of polemics and that mindset.
Yeah.
Because it really is a mess. And I think things will work out eventually. It's not hard. The truth really is not it does not need that much of an argument. It
Yeah.
just stands alone by itself, and it becomes.
I mean, in this episode, I think we've attempted to cover pretty much every angle that we could possibly think of. And even though it's been at, some points may have been at surface level, whereas other points may have been developed very deep, I think we can conclude very, very, confidently to say this is as in where we stand today in terms of hadith and in terms of how we establish the sunnah. So I think one of the key things from here would be that, as Abu Abbas mentioned, that we need to go back to the Quran first and foremost, and actually appreciate, what Allah Azza wa Jal has revealed. The first point being, and secondly, even when it comes to the matter of hadith, we've presented these methodologies, and these methodologies haven't been an appeal to say that. Look at how good our sources are, or look. The main point being is that how can we objectively use a methodology and actually establish the sunnah, find out what is true and what is false. And effectively, one of the key points of this theme throughout the whole podcast series actually is the issue of critical thinking. One of the terms that I regularly use, which is hadith criticism. Now, I know that Abu Abbas, we spoke about this very briefly in the introduction to Hadith episode about Hadith criticism and the role that Hadith criticism plays in order for us to actually, critically look through Hadith, critically look through transmitters, and actually identify, the truth from falsehood. So here would be my other question. For someone that's interested in using this level of critical thinking and maybe even getting into the hadith criticism issue, what would you recommend them? Some few tips in terms of how they should proceed, in terms of where to go, because one of the things could be is that a normal layman might want to actually get closer to the hadith, Quran and Sunnah. I mean, that's fine, but what about for the individual that actually wants to review the methodologies of hadith? I know we mentioned books like, Ibn Hajar's books, but I mean, for this specific scenario, what would you recommend, even if it is from your own works, that is?
Okay, so we're talking about
but we can cover both, by the way. There's both. Yeah.
Okay. So for an English-speaking audience, unfortunately, there's not material in the Arab world, which is understandable. So we have a lot of good content, alhamdulillah, and some of it, for example, I've heard good things about Jonathan Brown's book, Misquoting Muhammad. It's pretty good, apparently. I've heard good things about it. We have good papers, good books. So Abdullah Mu'taz has a good ebook called In Defense of the Hadith Method. I would strongly, recommend that anyone interested actually goes to this book. We'll mention a link. We'll link all these articles with, inshallah. So in this book, he goes over, for example, the issue of objectivity, the issue of bias, talks about the methodology of the muhaddithin, the evaluated transmitters, and he gives some examples. So this is, a good source. Abdullah Mu'taz also has, some articles, good articles published on Islamic Discourse Initiative. I would recommend. So the Hadith section on Islamic Discourse Initiative is pretty good. I recently published an article called "The Question of Hadith and Politics." I know this is an issue that a lot of people are concerned about. Were the muhaddithin political stooges? Were they tools that were used by political? I address this issue, and I, look at the data, and I show my conclusion in the article. So that's, another good source to go to. I have another article called "Nuance and Praise and Criticism: An Example in Objectivity," or a case study in objectivity. Go over it. So we're essentially just laying out the methodology. We're telling people, listen, just look at it. This is what we have. And this is the data that's on the paper. And it speaks for itself. And so, that's pretty much. We can link, a bunch of sources, inshallah. That will be useful for the reader who's interested. I don't have them all, memorized off the top of my head. But there's a lot of content, inshallah.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely put in a good list, inshallah. And I want to leave on one note, and this note isn't just for Shias, it's both for Sunnis and Shias. And this question would be is that I don't know whether you have any idea of how to answer this, or maybe we can answer it inside another episode. But for someone that wants to look into hadith, not really, even the methodological aspects, but rather just the contents of hadith and getting closer to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what kind of books would you start with? Because I mean, if you want to go straight to the books of hadith and analyze the narrations for yourself, this can often sometimes lead to doubts, not even doubts, but rather confusion, because they don't understand the context of the hadith many times, right? So, would you recommend anything that essentially has hadith or has hadiths within context or with a summary or a commentary that someone could refer back to that are known to, be established in the Sunnah?
Yeah. So the issue you talked about is actually an important point. Now, the books of hadith today, books like Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Jami' al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abi Dawud, these books were authored for jurists and for experts. Hence why, for example, the chapter headings in these books are usually related to fiqh, right? And different issues of fiqh. Now, obviously, some of them, like Sahih Muslim, the chapter headings are not from Muslim himself, but from, Qadi Iyad and An-Nawawi and whatnot. But for the most part, these books were authored for experts. And it is only an expert who actually be able to utilize the value of these books to its utmost extent. With that being said, now when we're going to recommend a source to the layman Muslim, well, we need to take into account several things. Well, what is the average Muslim interested in? What is the Muslim interested in deriving from hadith? Now, there are several things people usually like. First of all, they like stories, right? People want to know and learn the story of their prophet. And so that's why people usually recommend seerah books like Al-Rahiq al-Makhtoum. Honestly, it's the only major contemporary seerah work I'm familiar with, that is suitable for someone who's not necessarily an expert. Yeah. I know there are a bunch of other works people recommend. I have not read them, so I can't vouch for them. Maybe if you know anything good in the seerah, you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, in English, in the English series, I mean, there's quite a few seerah works. Like, some people refer to Ibn Kathir's translation. There's even works like Dr. Ali Salabi's, which has sort of a focus on identifying Sahih Hadith from weak Hadith, so on and so forth. But on this note, I would actually encourage anyone that is interested in terms of specific sources or specific areas of discussion they would like to actually learn more upon, to actually join the server. We have loads of different topics that are discussed in the server, from history to economics, both at a contemporary level and both at a historical level, when you specifically look into the hadith and conceptualize them. So, of course, we'll include the link to the server in the description box below, and we'll also link all the sources that we've mentioned throughout the episode. Alhamdulillah, I mean, Abu Abbas, we've covered pretty much everything, right, at this point. So once again, I want to thank you, Abu Abbas, for giving your time and really being thorough in this analysis that we've given forward. And also, I would like to thank the Sunni Defense, because essentially today the Sunni Defense, the role that they play within the media, on social media, within these platforms and these discussions, is to portray an objective narrative and look through these issues that are raised in a critical manner. And in that sense and on that level, this is why the Islamic Thought podcast was essentially created, to essentially do the same thing. And that's why I would recommend every single one of you to actually go through the videos of the Sunni Defense and actually learn the issues that you may be interested in, from an objective basis, of course. And also, encourage everyone to actually get engaged on the server. If they have any issues, if they have any questions, you're more than welcome to pose those questions and come. And on that note, Abu Abbas, it's been absolutely an honor to actually do this episode, and hopefully we can do a lot more after this. I know that we had some plans to do the episode like the politics one, so I'm hoping that inshallah ta'ala we'll be able to do that soon. Is there anything maybe you want to add on, or do you think we've missed out or anything like that?
I think we've pretty much covered everything. I really enjoy and appreciate the collaboration, and I think it should happen more often, inshallah, between us and various different organizations, initiatives. And I think a lot of good can come out of this, inshallah.
Yeah, 100% agreed. So
And other than that, I'd invite subscribe to the Islamic Thought podcast on YouTube and the Sunni Defense as well. And inshallah, there will be a lot of content coming in the future. Bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad.
yeah, definitely. Just as mentioned before, now we are on iTunes. We're on different various platforms on Android and on iPhone, where you can actually listen to the podcast, download it, and also view it on YouTube. So on that note, thank you guys all for listening. Ma as-salama.